Hi there, Sophie Glenn here, and today we're going to be talking about the joiner. So the joiner is one of the machines that we use pretty frequently when making furniture pieces or doing any kind of fine woodworking. And essentially what it does is that we start with a rough board like we have here. So this is a rough piece of ash right here. And the joiner basically allows us to have one surface face, the face of the board here, and one surfaced edge, so that we can properly use it on the table saw and the planer. So I'll get to those in other videos, but we'll talk about the joiner just now. Alright, so first, before you start anything on the joiner, you want to make sure that the area is nice and clean. So if someone's been on here before, you want to make sure they essentially clean up after themselves, not have any debris on both the in-feed and the out-feed tables. And you also want to make sure that the floor is clear too, so you're not slipping and sliding all over the place, because this is a very dangerous machine. So you want to make sure that we're working safely whenever we can. With that, with safety, you want to make sure that the safety guard is working in place. So that's this little arm here. So what this does is that it covers the knife head here. So here we have a helical head blade. So it's got a bunch of little square knives that form a helical pattern on the cylinder that does all the cutting for us. And this basically helps keep the piece of wood up close against the back fence here, but also covers the teeth from being in harm's way. So you want to make sure that that's working properly. So if you have an older machine, sometimes it'll have a little spring that's attached to the machine, so you just want to make sure that's all set up. So here this is working properly, so it's doing its job right there. You also want to check that the knives aren't dull. So these are probably a little bit dull because I haven't had a chance to change them out yet. But if you see like any chips in any of the teeth, or if there's a bunch of you're joining stuff that's got glue on it, that'll tend to gunk up on the knives. So you just want to make sure that those are all nice and clean and sharp before you start working on here. Because if you're working with dull tools, then that's just going to make your job exponentially harder. So if they are dull, just get the shop tech or myself to change out the knives for you. And luckily here on a helical head, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is, because there's made up of a bunch of square cutter heads, so each square has 4 edges to cut with. So if one side's dull, you just turn it and switch it to one of the other edges. And easy as that. Now if you have a straight head or straight knife cutter head on here, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. So then you have to replace the knives and make sure it's level with the table, but that's a whole other ball game. But for our purposes, we'll just say this is good to go. Okay. You also want to make sure you have a push stick handy. So this is a push stick. So I've talked about these in other videos. It's basically acts as a sacrificial hand for us. So I can have my board back here. Instead of having my fingers back here where my thumb might be in harm's way, I can use the push stick to actually help push this piece along. It also gives you a little bit more leverage too. So if you're not as strong as maybe someone else is, you can use this push stick to help you push things forward. Okay. Also just want to make sure you have the basic safety equipment. So I got my safety glasses on already, and I have my earmuffs ready to go. This is a very loud machine, so you do want to make sure that you have both hearing and eye protection on when you're working on it. And this is also one that the dust collection needs to be on for, because this accumulates a lot of wood dust. So you just want to make sure that that's going. Other things too, you want to make sure that you're setting the height of the in-feed table to the appropriate cutting length, or cutting height rather. So here there's a small gauge on here. It goes from 0 to all the way to 1/2 inch. You never want to cut a full 1/2 inch off the machine, because you'll just bog it down and probably run the motor out. So the most that you're ever going to want to cut in one pass is a 1/16 of an inch. So right now it's at just about at 1/16 of an inch, but if I needed to reset it, I could just unlock it here and just raise this little handle up or down one way. So right now it's pretty much set at 0, so that means the in-feed table is flush with the cutter head. So now I'm going to set it just a 1/16 below, so that as I'm pushing this piece of wood through, it's going to cut off a 1/16 of an inch, and then the out-feed table, which is always flush with the cutter head, is going to help me pass it right along. All right. So make sure that's set to about a 1/16 of an inch. And again, that's the maximum you want to cut on here. And another thing too is to make sure that you always, it says it on here, it says 12-inch minimum length. So if you have a really short board that you're trying to plane, you're going to have to, joint. I'm saying plane, but it's joint. So if you have a smaller piece of wood that you need to joint or you need to flatten an edge of, you'll probably have to do some other technique to get it to be flat, either by hand planing it or sanding the crap out of it. But hand planing it is preferred. So if you have something that's smaller than 12 inches, you won't be able to use the joiner. And that's basically just because of safety for the most part. So if you have a tiny little piece of wood on here, then that's putting your fingers or your push stick in a basically putting your body in a very vulnerable and dangerous position. So 12-inch minimum on here. In terms of width, this particular joiner has an 8-inch wide capacity, so I can cut a board that's maximum 8 inches. If you have a board that's wider than that, if you have a wider joiner, then that's great. You can just use that. But if you don't, then what you can do is you can cut it on the bandsaw, because the bandsaw doesn't care if you have a flat side or not. So you can cut it to length on the bandsaw, and then you can go ahead and joint the boards. All right? So other things about the joiner. So like I said, we're joining one face and one edge. We're going to do the face first, and then we're going to do the edge. We'll join this face, and then we'll join the very edge like that. So the reason we do the edge first, the reason we do the face first is because we don't have a flush surface to reference the fence off of. So right now we could just get the face nice and flat and flush, and then we can use that to reference onto the back fence. And so another thing you have to do before you start working on here is to make sure that your fence is square to the outfeed table. So you can take a little combo square here and just have it nice flush at a 90-degree angle. And you try to want to get it as close to the cutter head as you can, either like right behind it, or you can even come back. You can measure in a couple of different spots. But you measure here, and right now it's pretty square. But if you needed to adjust it, you can unlock it back here, then unlock this guy, and then you can adjust it manually this way or that way. So right now, it's actually pretty good right there. Just little micro adjusting, and then once you get it in the right spot, you can lock these both back into place, and you have a nice square surface here. So the reason we want that square is because, again, if you're doing fine furniture, you need nice square corners, then this is going to allow you to get that. So if you're starting off with a weird angle, then that's going to affect how it cuts through a table saw or through a bandsaw, then you'll end up with all sorts of weird angles, which we don't want. And it's also not safe. You always want to have, especially on the table saw, if you have a square corner, you need to have a square corner in order to use the table saw. But I'll get to that in the table saw video. Okay, so this is more or less set up. So now I'll talk about how to feed this through. So I have my push stick handy again, and I also have one of these handy. So these are actually little magnetic things that just live right on the side of the joiner here. So when I'm feeding this piece of wood through, I always want to keep my hands on it. So either like this manually, but for more safety, you can use one of these to help you push it through. And it's got like a little pad on here to give you a little bit of friction, and then you can just push it straight on through that way. All right? Again, I got at least 12 inches on here, so that's good. The other thing you want to look out for is if your board has a little bit of a curve to it, so you might be able to see here. I have the concave side down, so it's pointing this way. Sort of make that hand gesture. I'll try to do it in the window there so you can see it. So if it's curved upward like this, you're not gonna have 2 points of contact on here. So to check, you can just see how wobbly that is, right? So you don't want that, because when you're joining that through, then your face is going to be all sorts of different angles, and you're not actually going to have a flat face. However, if you're starting with the concave side down, it's already nice and flat to start with. So it's going to flatten those two highest points on the edges here, and then it'll continue to keep that board nice and flat. So you always want to have the concave side down. Okay. Before you start wheeling away on here, when you turn it on, you just want to make sure it's going at full speed. So it takes maybe a second or two to get there. And then when you're done, you always want to make sure it comes to a complete stop. So that if someone's coming on here right after you, just make sure that it's at a complete stop, just for safety purposes. So about the wood, this is just, like I said, a piece of ash. So Boards that you never want to run through here are plywood because of the glue content in there, and that'll really gum up the cutter head. So that'll make you need to change the knives out a little bit more frequently, and we don't want to do that. You never want to take end grain on here because that's a really tough area, and that'll just eat those teeth big time. So you never want to do some doohickey thing like this. And you always want to go with the grain, so along the length of the boards. You never want to go across like this kind of deal, right? You don't want to use softwoods on here, especially pines, because they typically have a lot of sap in them, and the sap is really harmful to the cutter head. So we don't want to use pines on here. And MDF also. So MDF is basically a particle board that's made with wood dust and glue, essentially. So that adhesive in the MDF is really going to do bad things to the cutter heads. We don't want to do that. If you're using a piece of like secondhand woods, you need to make sure that there's no nails or staples or anything in it, because the metal can harm the teeth on here. So you don't want to. So you want to make sure to pull any of that stuff out. And if there's a lot of moisture in it, I would just refrain from using the joiner on any kind of wet wood, because that could rust surfaces and rust the knives, and we don't want that to happen. Okay, so I'm ready to plane. So my handy assistant in the background is going to turn on the dust collection, so it's going to start to get loud in here. Okay, the dust collection is on and the vent is open, so I'm good to go. I'll put my ear protection on. And to start this up, this has a safety switch on it. So I'll need to pull this out first, and then I can turn it on. Now I'll put my earmuffs on. I'll use this here. You see my stance, I was kind of doing this action, so I was spreading my feet pretty far apart and just moving along with the piece. You can see it just took the edges down a bit. So now I can continue to do this until it's nice and flat on it. I can actually leave it as is. As long as it's about 80% planed down, you're good to go, because then you can run it through the planer and take care of the rest of it. We'll just say this is good enough. So now I can join an edge. Now what I do, okay. So now that I have a face planed down, jointed down, so now what I'll do is I'll start to joint the edge. So what I want to do here is hold it up as taut to this fence as possible. So I'll have my fingers up here and then my thumb over the top. So my fingers are actually pressing it up against the fence, and my thumb is just kind of keeping it in place and helping keep my hand not from being down here. So you want your fingers obviously out of the way of the cutter head. And back here, my thumb is just going to basically act as a push stick, and it's high enough where my fingers are going to be out of the way of the cutter head. So I'm just going to be pushing it forward that way. So you can turn it back on. So I'll demonstrate again. Okay, dust collection. There it is. Again, rolling it up against here. Pressing it up. You notice my hand was kind of moving along with it, so I'm still keeping it up against that fence. See, it's got a nice pointed edge here. Okay, so when you're done, you want to make sure again it comes to a full stop, so it's safe for the next person who's going to use it. And just common courtesy, if this sometimes gets out of whack, you just want to make sure this is nice and square again. And you just do that the same way I showed you before. And to double check that your edge is square, you can take your combo square, since we got that nice 90 degree here. You can hold it up against here, so I'll do it this way. And I got a very nice square edge here. So, perfect. So now it's ready to use on the table saw, and then I'm ready to use the planer to get the other faces flat.